On November 27th, the unmotivated, ill-equipped, poorly supplied Russian forces broke through the Ukrainian front south of Bakhmut. Are we witnessing the start of the much anticipated Russian winter offensive? It was reported that the Russians stormed the villages of Ozaryanivka, Zelenopilya, Koryomivka, and Andrivka, located roughly 15 kilometers south of Bakhmut. Here's a video that confirms the Russian capture of Koryomivka. At the same time, their troops also began an assault on Opitne, where they managed to enter the first buildings of the town. This city controls the southern axis of the city of Bakhmut. If the Russians reach Ivanivske, it's GG, well played. Game over. The maneuver the Russians are going for is essentially the one I laid out 3 months ago. Just looking at a map, it seems to me that the Russians aim at taking a hold at the TO513 highway, from where they could attack Bakhmut from the south. And in the worst case scenario, they could even push their advance further towards the H20 highway, thus completely shutting off supplies towards Bakhmut. Now the media is coping. They claim that the Russians are obsessed with Bakhmut, a town with little other importance. How Bakhmut is just a symbolic prize. This cannot be further from the truth. This is exactly what they said just before the fall of Severodonetsk. You see, if the Russians break down the gates of Bakhmut, it paves the way to the entire northern Donetsk. A new flower will bloom towards Seversk, Soledar, Slavyansk, Kramatorsk, Kostiantynivka and Toretsk. And even then, the strategy the Russians seem to go for is much more elaborate. Their plan is to penetrate deep into Ukrainian lines and devastate their rears. The famous Soviet D doctrine. Deep battle doctrine. To make it simple for you guys, Russia wants to hook up with Bakhmut, but they got the L. So to make Bakhmut jealous, the Russians are seducing her bestie, Decisive. That is pretty curvy, you know, because it sits on the hilltop. Problem is, Chechens come into the equation. So if they get Decisive, they also get Bakhmut. Welcome to History Legends. Here are the latest news about the Russo-Ukrainian war. Remember that if you're new to this channel, make sure to subscribe and check out my Ukraine playlist so you don't miss anything I've said in the past. And as you know, like with many other commentators, some of my Ukraine videos were targeted with limited or no ads. So make sure to check out my Patreon or PayPal to keep the show running. Thank you to everyone that has already helped, and welcome to the headquarters. Trouble in Bakhmut. Here you can see retired US Marine Corps Colonel Milburn in Bakhmut. He founded the Mozart PMC, and he says he will do everything to defend the city from the Wagner PMC. Who will prevail, Mozart or Wagner? Truth is, the situation in Bakhmut has been tense for some time. We're talking about 20,000 Ukrainians against 30,000 Russians. The problem is we don't really know the balance of power regarding armored vehicles, tanks, and artillery. Although recently Zelensky mentioned that the Russians had a 9-to-1 advantage regarding artillery. Meanwhile, Russian aviation has also been very active over Bakhmut, which makes me wonder, where is Ukrainian air defense? On November 27th, the New York Times wrote an interesting article. They wrote how the day before their arrival in Bakhmut, 240 wounded Ukrainian soldiers had come through the hospital's doors with everything from gunshot wounds to shrapnel injuries and concussions. And the day they arrived, there were already 50 wounded just by noon. 240 wounded in one day, plus all the KIA is roughly 300 casualties in 24 hours. That means that a 3,000 strong brigade has a lifetime of about 10 days in Bakhmut. While digging new trenches, this Ukrainian soldier said that only 5 men remained from his 30-man platoon. There are also a lot of reports that the Russian bombardment in and around Bakhmut is at an intensity never seen before. As you can see here, it looks like Stalingrad, with buildings that had been shelled before having been shelled again and again. Meanwhile, the front line on the city's outskirts look like a scene from World War I. We can also notice that these Ukrainian trenches are filled with water, which could indicate that they were hastily built, since they lack reinforcing on the sides and don't have proper flooring. All over the front, Ukrainian forces have a hard time sending reinforcements because their wheeled vehicles get stuck in the mud. For this reason, Ukrainian counter-battery fire becomes complicated because it happens that their MRLS systems also get stuck. Meanwhile, in this video, you can see the extreme pressure Ukrainian mortar crews are under. This team is rushing to move. because if they stay at one position too long, they might be spotted by enemy artillery. The New York Times mentioned that Bakhmut was defended by some sort of Ukrainian Kampfgruppe, some sort of task force, including the elite 93rd Mechanized and 58th Motorized Infantry Brigades. And this information can be corroborated by military land. We can see that the 93rd and 58th Brigades are indeed in the vicinity of Bakhmut. The city is also defended by the 214th Rifle Battalion that took part in the second battle for Liman, but also the 53rd Mechanized Brigade, as well as a territorial brigade. The article mentions how Ukrainian troops said that in the last couple days, the Russians had tried to make their advance more intensely, which makes sense since the weather is getting cold and the frozen ground favors mechanized operations. Apparently, according to the New York Times, the spearhead of the Russian offensive against Bakhmut is made of formations from the Wagner Group, supported by, drumroll, fresh forces redeployed from the Kherson front. Maybe the paratroopers, who probably want revenge since their withdrawal from Kherson. However, I could not find any data that validates this claim. On the Russian side, they actually mentioned that Wagner was supported by detachments of the Luhansk militia. That would mean that the bulk of Russian reserves have yet to be activated. The article also mentions that the Pentagon is worried at the rate Ukrainians use up ammunition. Ukrainians fire about 5,000 rounds a day, when US production is only 15,000 per month. Reports also mention how Ukrainians have trouble to bring their ammunition to the front, and often only have enough vehicles that they have to choose between ammo delivery or picking up wounded comrades. Really tragic, especially in these horrible muddy conditions. Russian pre-winter offensive. To me, it seems that the latest Russian attacks are more to shape the battlefield. Wagner created skillful, small assault groups that bypassed Ukrainian strongholds and threatened enemy flanks, while letting LPR militiamen mop up the remaining positions. I mentioned earlier how the Russian strategy is more elaborate than what we might think. Bakhmut has been on the Russian menu for some time now. Many months ago, the Russians first tried to envelop Bakhmut from the north, from Spirne, but that didn't work till this day. Then for a month, the Russians tried to take Solidar, which they could use as a stepping stone to turn Ukrainian positions, but they were stopped by a ferocious Ukrainian active defense of the city and the stubborn defense of the surrounding ridges, which you can see if we use an elevation map. And in the end, using this map, we can see how the Ukrainians forced the Russians to fight into this urban bottleneck. So it's no surprise that the Russians were stuck in this part of the front. Wagner formations also tried a direct assault on Bakhmut. They had initial success, but then faced multiple Ukrainian counterattacks. The Russians probably noticed that there were way too many factories to get control of, and these were perfect positions for the Ukrainians to defend the east side of the city. In the end, the Russians favored a different strategy, pinned down Ukrainian troops at Solidar and Bakhmut, and pushed through their overextended southern flank. I agree, it took weeks and weeks at the pace of a turtle, but eventually they made it. Once again, using the elevation map, you can see how the villages of Ozarynivka, Zelenopilya, Kordyumivka, and Kordyumivka are located on a hilltop, about 200 to 300 meters high. And that hill is overlooking Bakhmut. And looking at the geography of the terrain, I guess that the bulk of Russian forces attacked from Mayorsk in a south-north axis, with supporting actions on the flanks. This high point that the Russians now control allows them to overlook the tactically important villages of Klishivka and Ivanivske. And that last village, Ivanivske, is very important. If the Russians get hold of it, it would cut off the entire western Ukrainian supply route going towards Bakhmut. Now I don't think the Russian plan is to rush down the valley and capture Bakhmut, but instead push along this ridge, along this canal. It's the highest point in Donbass. It also explains the Russian attack on Andrivka. I'm telling you, the moment the Russians hold this entire high ground, things will become very unpleasant for Ukraine. Here's why. The setup of this battle is very similar to what Napoleon Bonaparte faced at the Battle of Rivoli. Facing a numerically superior enemy, Bonaparte took the advantage of a hilltop to fend off Austrian attacks, and the advantage of his central position to ensure that Austrian columns could not mutually support each other. The Austrians ended up attacking piecemeal, and all the French had to do was to defeat them in detail, aka one by one. Back to 2022. By holding the high ground, the Russians positioned themselves in between Ukrainian formations at Toretsk, Konstantinivka, Chasiv Yar, and Bakhmut. For this maneuver to be successful, the Russians will absolutely have to capture Chasiv Yar. which also happens to be one of the biggest logistical hubs in the entire region. Fun fact, Chasiv Yar means Yar's clock. Now you know some Russian. I also told you in a previous video that Izium means raisins. Spirnoye means contested. And surprisingly, the city holds its name because it changed hands so many times. Opitnoye means experimental. And now you can easily seduce a Russian spy by telling her, or him, dodge the bullet. Opitnaye Chasiv Spirnaye Izium. Let me know how it goes. Hold on, why am I telling you all this? From bad to worst. As we've seen, the Russians now threaten the crossroad of Bakhmut and the high ground of Chasiv Yar. But the clock is ticking. The Ukraine command is in a very difficult position, similar to what they faced at Severodonetsk. In the art of war, it's always good to corner your enemy and force him to choose between a bad and a worse decision. Option 1, the bad one. If counterattacks fail to regain the high ground, Ukrainians will have to pull back from Bakhmut and rebuild a new line of defense centered around Chasiv Yar, which would run along this ridge up to the Seversky Donets River. However, retreating from Bakhmut also means abandoning this entire area, this strategic ridge, Solidar, and of course Seversk, which would then put the Ukraine formations around Liman in jeopardy. And interestingly enough, this question about strategic hilltops around the city has left a deep wound in the heart of the Russians. Ukrainians can hold Bakhmut at all costs and push reinforcement through a Russian artillery kill zone, sustaining massive losses, and try to hold the key defensive positions. But this leaves the defense of their flanks at Chasiv Yar in a vulnerable position. In the coming days or weeks, we can expect the Russians to squeeze out Ukraine formations from the triangle Opitne-Ivanivsky-Klishivka in order to protect the right flank of their maneuver. Now, in the worst case scenario, if Chasiv Yar falls, not only Bakhmut becomes a snowy repeat of Dien Bien Phu, but then the Russians can simply complete their encirclement maneuver, besiege the city, avoid a deadly urban battle, and wait for mobilized troops to be combat ready. This maneuver is strangely similar to what the Syrian government forces did during the siege of Aleppo. A very similar maneuver. Curious, eh? And to make this bliat worse, at the same time, if the Russians have enough reserves, they can flank, turn west, and capture the town of Kostiantynivka. And then, like dominoes falling, they can swipe all Ukrainian positions along the Donbass front, namely all the fortified positions around Toretsk and Avdiivka. To avoid this nightmare scenario, Ukraine has to find reinforcements to plug the gaps, slow down the enemy and force them to lose momentum. Reportedly, they're sending units from the Zaporozhye front. There was this mention how a battery of 10 M777s were sent to Donbass. Now the problem of it all is that apparently Ukrainians have a hard time transferring all their troops from Kherson towards Bakhmut, mainly due to shutdowns of the electric rail network. The Russians also did something pretty dirty. Reportedly, instead of launching missiles on train tracks or train stations, they struck a train station in Dnipro just at the moment when units of the 17th Ukrainian Armored Brigades were loading onto the trains. If this is true, this is terrible. This is all I have for you today. Let me know in the comment section what you thought of my analysis. If you're new to this channel, make sure to like and subscribe. And if you want to support the channel, make sure to check out my Patreon or PayPal. The links are in the description.